What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another SK Wealth Academy podcast number 88B, our prelude to podcast number 89. And this podcast is titled A Simple Way to Discover Truth. In this podcast, I'm going to reveal the simple way to discover truth besides asking the question, Cui Bono, or who benefits, as long as you modify that question by adding one word to the end of that question. Who benefits monetarily? Because often by following the trail of money, you can get the answer to a lot of questions about a lot of different topics. Now, in a previous podcast in which I discussed the complex chess games that the powers that be execute against us, a viewer asked whatever happened to Occams Razor, meaning the simplest answer is likely the correct answer. Well, what happened in a nutshell was perpetual counterintelligence campaigns waged against us and continuous propaganda deployed against us for decades that has rendered the application of Occams Razor near useless, as Occams Razor would be deployed in a manner that analyzes perceived reality instead of actual reality, which are two quite different concepts. In other words, much of what society believes today is actual reality is just perceived reality, as the powers that be have been playing this chess game of perception management with us for decades now. So the simplest way to receive the truth about the enormous array of unknowns that exist in the world would be simply to use billionaires as test bunnies for the widespread application of various agendas that exist in the modern time today. So though I have very strong opinions due to my independent research into some, but not all, of these following topics, I'm going to present all of these topics in a manner as if I had no opinion about them and was still seeking an answer. As the title of this podcast implies, a methodology to use if you had questions and were unsure about the answer. So let's get started. Want to know if Monsanto and Syngenta GMO produced food is safe for human consumption or more likely to cause cancer and other serious health problems down the road? Well, feed one of its biggest advocates, US Shark Tank TV shows host Kevin O'Leary, nothing but Monsanto GMO grains, especially soybeans, corn, and rice, and other foods every day for 6 months straight. Why feed Kevin O'Leary? Because, as I mentioned, he's one of the biggest advocates of what he professes to be the massively positive social footprint of GMO food in solving world hunger. So I would feed Kevin O'Leary nothing but Monsanto food, especially, like I said, GMO corn, then soybeans and rice and other GMO foods. And if he refuses to eat these products, then we know they're unsafe. Much as how a prosecuting attorney presented a glass of Roundup to Monsanto's defense attorney to drink in court during a proceeding in which the prosecuting attorney had brought a case against Monsanto on behalf of a client that had contracted cancer from using Roundup to spray his GMO crops without any protective gear, because Monsanto's employees were putting out the narrative that Roundup was as safe to use as water. And in fact, one of their defense attorneys said it's so safe you could drink a whole glass of it just like water. And of course, the Monsanto lawyer refused to drink it, immediately revealing his act of perjury. So let's move on. Want to know if the scientific studies that claim serious adverse health effects have been discovered from constant exposure to 5G microwaves of a deployed 5G network? Well, build 5G transmitting towers that surround the homes of the top 10 wealthiest billionaires in your nation, as well as the homes of all the corporate executives whose companies are installing these 5G networks, and expose them to these microwaves for 6 months straight, every single day, every week, before allowing installation on a wide scale level. And even if these executives or these billionaires go on holiday, install the 5G transmitting towers around their vacation homes as well. So they have constant exposure for 6 months, because if it's safe, then none of them should object. But if the executives and billionaires refuse, then refuse installation in the entire nation. Simple, right? Okay, let's move on. Want to know if the eventual virus vaccine that one of Bill Gates' heavily invested pharmaceutical companies rolls out as a mandatory vaccine for everyone in the future to allow our individual freedom and movement about that country freely and across international borders? Well, then round up Bill, Melinda, and his children, along with Bill's top 10 closest friends and all their families, and inject them with this vaccine that they will want to inject us with live on television, and ensure there's no trickery in switching out the vaccine with another harmless one by tasking an independent auditor with oversight of the process, and having the auditor ensure the vaccines are tested for authenticity immediately prior to vaccinating Bill Gates, his family, his friends, and their friends' families. And if Gates or any of these members that are to be vaccinated, because they're all telling us it's safe, refuse, then destroy this particular vaccine and ensure no one in the entire world receives it. Now, of course, I'm being a little cheeky in my suggestion, because we all know that we can't enforce behaviors on billionaires that they enforce upon us daily. However, we can research the answers to these questions with a little bit of investigative journalism, because yes, as shocking as it may be, investigative journalism is still alive. It's only dead in the mass media, but in independent media, it is still alive, because I know one of the prior platforms of independent journalism that I have recommended to all of you is Grayzone. I think Grayzone has some great investigative journalism going on. So again, even when you find a platform that you really dig, you can't basically trust everything that you read blindly. You still have to vet it for yourself, and you still, I would say, not every single journalist working on that platform will be equally credible. So find the ones you find to be most credible and follow those. But we can still research the answers to the questions I just posed with a little bit of help from investigative journalists. And we can likely find out the answers to all of the above questions. So if none of the company executives and billionaires that were pushing for the adoption of shady or questionable, maybe questionable, technology, food, although I say GMO food is shady, and vaccines are subjecting themselves, their families, and their closest friends to being injected with or eating with or adopting whatever technology, then by all means we should stand up and refuse the implementation of these particular areas in our communities as well, or these agendas. We already know the harm that some technology and social media apps inflict upon us, as the inventors of these hardware and software technologies are on record and stating that even their own children are not allowed to use them. As a quick example, I'll cite the late Steve Jobs of Apple. When he was launching a new iteration of the iPad, a journalist asked him, "What do your children think of the iPad?" And he stated, "Well, my kids have never used one," which revealed his true thoughts about the technology his own company was pushing on everyone else. So to answer unknowns that remain closely guarded secrets and that will likely never become public knowns, because there are some unknowns that are much more difficult to uncover the truth about than others, we can still apply common sense to deduce the best possible guess regarding the correct answer, because in many instances, the answer is hiding in plain sight. For example, I'll give you one example of this. During the Hong Kong, in air quote, freedom demonstrations that were so violent just a few months ago before the pandemic shut everything down, there was a big question of whether U.S. alphabet intelligence agencies were fostering some of the chaos and violence of the protests that were really dragging the Hong Kong economy down the drain. And there existed an equally big divide among people who believed the answer to that question was definitively yes, and those that adamantly stated no way. Well, if we just look to one piece of graffiti spray painted on a Hong Kong wall during those protests, that piece of graffiti gave away the presence of U.S. Agent Provocateurs that existed among the Hong Kong protesters, and I'll tell you why I believe this. Now, it wasn't 100% proof, and I'll give you the counter argument to the argument I'm going to state to you, but the graffiti stated F the popo. So if you're an American that grew up in California, you know that the term popo for police was uniquely a Californian concept and a Western concept, heavily used in lyrics by gangster rap groups like NWA. Now, the term popo as slang for police originated from California bicycle cops who always patrolled in pairs and who wore uniforms with PO, that stood for police officer, emblazoned across their uniforms. So when they stood next to each other, what did you get? PO, PO, which formed the word popo. So that's where that slang originated from. So run a search for a Hong Kong police and you will not find a single uniform. I went through dozens and dozens of pictures of Hong Kong police and could find no Hong Kong police, even from photos that were like a decade old, that were wearing uniforms that had the abbreviation PO. So there'd be no reason for Hong Kong locals to ever refer to Hong Kong police as the popo unless they're influenced by a Westerner agent provocateur. So it's possible that perhaps a Hong Kong protester that tagged that particular piece of graffiti, say, was a huge American gangster rap fan, and that's where he co-opted that term. But it still, to me, it would be extremely strange that a local national would adopt the slang of a foreign nation, and outdated slang at that. See, it's not even up to date. That slang was popular like in the 1990s, but it's not anymore. So to use outdated 1990s slang for police that's a foreign origination to voice protests really seems very questionable to me. So teens today don't go around, or most of the Hong Kong protesters were either teenagers or young adults, like under the age of 25, or at least under the age of 30. So they don't go around saying stuff that teenagers or young adults said back in the day. They don't go around saying, yo, that was fat, or use slang like that. So common sense would inform us that the likelihood of a local national scrawling that graffiti was extremely low. So for everyone that said, the Hong Kong protests were just organically grown, there is some evidence that common sense would tell you to the opposite of that belief. So the exercise of common sense, while it won't make an unknown question known, will often provide very strong reasons to dismiss or accept various existing narratives as highly likely or highly unlikely. And finally, please understand that without struggle, truth cannot be discovered. I don't know how many times and how many different podcasts I've said iron sharpens iron. And through the 15 years I've been publishing original content in the form of articles on my news sites and on my podcast sites. And pretty soon, actually, since I do make higher quality audio recordings on a professional recorder in the form of MP3 files, I will likely start uploading these podcasts in audio format only and start posting them on iTunes and whatever all the popular, I can't think off the top of my head, all the popular podcast platforms are under the title SK Wealth Academy Podcast. So for those of you that want to listen on the run, literally while going for a run or working out, you can listen to my podcast very soon on those other podcast platforms. But I diverged for a second and went off topic. I was saying through the 15 years I've been publishing original content, I've repeatedly heard comments similar to the following. Something like, I loved all the knowledge and truth you're dropping until you spoke about such and such. And then I started to question a lot of what you are saying. And the translation of that is merely the following. Everything that you speak about with which I agree, I believe to be true. But the minute your opinion diverges from mine, then you're off point and you're not sticking to truth anymore. However, this is not how truth works. Truth doesn't mean that everything with which you agree with me is true, but everything with which you disagree is false. At times, in a lapse of logic, instead of addressing and stating what I said was untrue, those that disagree with information I stated, and I'm telling you this has been something that's been consistent for 15 years, for those that have been following me for that long. So I actually appreciate those that have stuck with me for that long, that have actually expressed this type of disagreement with me, because that means at least you're open-minded enough to keep interest in my viewpoints and the information I have to divulge. But in any event, sometimes there's people that disagree with information I state, or merely state that my politics were distorting the information that I told, that involved information with which they disagreed. So, but those that follow me for a decade know that I am pretty much apolitical, meaning that I will criticize anyone belonging to any party, any group affiliation, when I believe they engage in deception, regardless if that person engaging in the deception even belongs to any groups with whom I identify very strongly with. So in other words, after his first month in office, when US President Barack Obama filled his entire cabinet administration with Wall Street power players, I published an article, and this is within the first month, I think, that he took office back in 2009. I wrote an article stating that his message of hope that got him elected was entirely fraudulent, which sparked some angry responses from some in the community of his supporters that called me a racist for calling Barack a fraud, which is about a devoid of logic argument as possible, because it's a ridiculous assertion based upon zero truth. And then when I levied criticisms against Trump, when Trump became president, some of the people that followed me for years that were Trump supporters expressed surprise that I criticized Trump, stating that because I hated Obama, they thought I would love Trump. And to begin, I don't hate Obama. I never stated any hate for Obama, but stated that the conflict between his actions and words exposed him as a hypocrite and a fraud, which I will still stand by to this day. But for those that follow me from the jump, you know that I found behaviors of Bush Sr., George W., Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, all to criticize over the years. So I'm not a partisan player at all, as people wrongly accuse me of being, as the only driving force behind my criticism is the exposition of truth. So if people came to my podcast and expect to hear the truth, they should also expect to disagree with me at times, and I will explain exactly why in a second. Because if people only want to hear others parrot back to them their own beliefs, where do you have a lot of mass media distribution channels fulfilling that role, like CNN, NBC, and Fox News? I am not interested in trying to serve any agenda or trying to please everyone or please any agenda except the agenda of truth. And the probability is that as hard as I try to bring you the truth at all times, there will be times I fail, because nobody is infallible. But because I know the very high standards to which I hold myself, those times will be far and few between. So that's why I chose to name my company Smart Knowledge Wealth Academy. Not just Smart Wealth Academy or not just Wealth Academy, because all knowledge is not wise. There's a lot of junk or toxic knowledge out there. So the saying that knowledge is power is completely false. Is not all knowledge nourishes. I learned a lot of knowledge when I received my MBA, for example, but once I moved from the academic environment to the real world, I learned that nearly every single thing, and I am not exaggerating, as you will find out when I launch SK Wealth Academy, if you take any of my courses, that every single thing practically that I learned about money, banking, and asset price mechanisms and behavior in business school was toxic knowledge. And the reason I call it toxic knowledge and not even misinformation was because possessing the type of knowledge that I was fed in business school, and I went to a top 15 business program at the time, describe the knowledge as toxic, because the knowledge that we're fed is a management perception game designed to keep us ignorant of the actual reality of how banking, money, capital markets operate. So I actually discovered that teaching someone the truth about money in capital market behavior is actually much easier to someone that has zero knowledge about these subjects than teaching it to someone that has a delusional belief that whatever he or she learned in business school was actually the truth. So in fact, one of the prerequisite courses for my SK Wealth Academy, which again is soon to be launched, is a course in critical thinking that I preface in the course introduction by stating that there will be portions of that course with which the reader or listener, as I provide both audio and text materials, will heavily disagree. So during the course of my martial arts training, all martial artists learn that you learn most not from those that you can defeat, but from those that can defeat you. And that in fact, you learn almost nothing from those you can easily defeat. But for some reason, when we get into debates with others, we just want smooth sailing all the time. And that is the way to not learn. So learning critical thinking skill development is the same. If you breeze through my course offering about critical thinking without any struggles, without heavily disagreeing with my points at times, I would say that my course was a very, very poorly designed course. Because if my course never challenged you enough to put you through real struggle, to put you through fire, to test you, to make you question your current belief system, to make you question the origination and development of your belief system, then it will have failed to further and refine your critical thinking skills. So what's the point of even going through the course if you're just going to say, oh, this sounds right to me, I believe everything, oh, I agree with everything you're saying. There's no point to a course about critical thinking that is designed like that. So during these points of conflict in my course, it is not a matter of whether I'm right and you're wrong or I'm wrong and you're right. Critical thinking is not about winning an argument or winning a debate, as far too many of us believe. Critical thinking is about not only understanding what we know really well, but also about recognizing what we don't know. Now, the latter part is the far more difficult part of the equation, of course, than the former. So the biggest conflict you will face if you take my critical thinking course when I launch my academy will not be from me, but it will come from within. Every person's biggest enemy in realizing the truth is not an external force, but it resides right here in your own mind. And it is my job in my academy to get you to be willing to be self-aware, self-reflective, introspective, and willing to challenge yourself. I also use outside examples to test people's critical thinking skills because I find that many of the very most popular YouTube commentators on political issues or social issues use woefully lacking arguments that are riddled with more holes in logic than Swiss cheese. So many people that are fans of these YouTubers internalize all intellectually based and very valid critiques of their favorite people's arguments as personal attacks on themselves and react poorly to such criticisms of their favorite people. However, this is a really important point. If one cannot overcome critiques of people they like and are just a fan of to adopt a far more objective perspective that is in much greater alignment with truth, then it will be nearly impossible for such a biased thinker to be objective about the things that he or she does not know. And to become a better critical thinker, we must be able to recognize what we do not know. So this is a prelude to podcast 89, in which I explain the massive difference in podcast 89 between adopted beliefs and learned and empirically tested beliefs. In my course about critical thinking, several exercises I ask the student to undertake will very likely reveal that many of my clients that take my courses, many of their beliefs have been adopted and never empirically tested and learned. So as this particular course of mine is a very lengthy course, as a much higher level of critical thinking cannot be achieved without having me walk you through the fire multiple times, not just once, but multiple times. Because as we know, the strongest sword is one that is forged in fire, not once, not twice, but multiple times. So there are actually several junctures in that course during which I believe the produced level of cognitive dissonance that I will produce by asking you to do certain exercises will be so high that many of the people taking the course may become frustrated enough to perhaps quit, simply because that course is a singular course in my academy that will produce the greatest emotional turmoil and psychological struggle. But here's the kicker. In discussing the marketing aspect of my academy, once I launch it with outside advisors, every one of them, to a T, highly recommended that I do not push that course as a prerequisite one, because I have to go back and look at my introductory materials, but I think I basically recommend 3 prerequisite courses as mandatory completion before you complete any other course. So one is about cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias that covers highly developed critical thinking skills. The second one is just finding purpose in life, as I believe, again, in a holistic definition of wealth. And the third one is just a course about everything you need to know about gold and silver price manipulation before you take any of the other courses that I offer in gold and silver. It's important to know those aspects. But of those 3 prerequisite courses, my outside advisors highly disagreed with me, including the one about critical thinking. And they suggested actually that I recommend people complete it last, because they told me it was a horrible lead course to convince clients to take further courses, because they said you're going to put them through so much fire and struggle right away that you're going to scare more people away from your academy. And the purpose of a lead course is to encourage them and attract them to take more courses. But I dismissed their advice, even though they're unanimous in their recommendation to me. And here's why. If your critical thinking skills are low, if they're average, or even if they're exceptional, I still believe all of us can hone and refine them every year to become continuously stronger. Every time I have a debate with someone, I try to have an open mind as much as possible, and an even more open mind than the last time I discussed a controversial topic with someone. So in that sense, I'm always refining and honing my own critical thinking skills. Since psychology and perception management are one of the strongest components of the perception game, without having high level critical thinking skills, I believe one will be easily misled into making poor decisions, as the majority heard is wrong the majority of the time. In fact, for my patrons that are listening to this, you will receive in June, on the 1st of June, in your bonus Patreon only podcast, a discussion of just some of the things that I have seen in the financial world that's happening right now that have been highly, highly deceptive. So if you receive your news on mainstream media, then and just believe, you don't understand there's a perception management game going on, even with people that seem, because I'm going to discuss at least one situation in which you would think at first the purpose of this revelation by this very prominent financial investment manager was to educate us. You'll see that there's a more nefarious underlying ulterior motive behind that. So without having high-level critical thinking skills, I believe that one will be easily misled into making poor decisions, as the majority heard is wrong the majority of the time. So I have the track record, hopefully you will agree, that I have the track record to prove this. As you can go to my news site, because again, my news site, I've been running that for 15 years. Then you can go back as far as April 2008, in which I predicted a US stock market crash would happen just 18 trading days before it actually happened. And I was ridiculed and mocked for that prediction back then. But if you want to look at more modern predictions, you can go in those 12 years and find many, many more predictions I made on my news site that came true as well. But if you want to just look at more modern predictions, just go back to about August of 2019, I recommend, and then just read a lot of the articles in which I predicted things that would happen. And you will see step by step that I predicted nearly every single step of our current financial crisis that manifested during Q1 of 2020 this year, just weeks or sometimes even a few months before they manifested. And because I know that gains in critical thinking can only be made with struggle, even though that particular course is the one that is almost certain to challenge you far more than any other of my courses, and will be the one that will have you disagreeing with far more content in that course than any of my other courses. I also know that the rewards gleamed from completion of all other courses, if you complete that one first, will be twice as great as never completing that course. So that's why I will keep that as one of my prerequisite courses. Because if you complete that course last on critical thinking, you will still probably reap a fair amount of value from my academy, but I will not be granting you the best possible chance to improve the quality of your life from using the content I offer in my course, because you will get far more out of every course by honing your critical thinking skills before you complete all other courses in my academy. And anyway, for those that would give up so easily from an initial significant obstacle, I feel that such people would be likely to give up on later coursework as well. And since my mission of developing my academy was always about leaving my greatest possible positive social footprint, I'd rather have 200 people complete all my coursework who are willing to overcome that initial significant obstacle and have the knowledge that I changed their lives significantly in the best way possible in my power, than versus having 2,000 people complete just half the coursework in a half-assed manner that barely improves their lives. Because a former accomplishment, even though it will be far less profitable, will enable me to leave a greater legacy on this planet. So I thought a lot about this topic because my arguments with my marketing advisors were loud and very aggressive and very heated, and they told me I needed to compromise my mission for the sake of profits. However, I already feel that so many people that sell the authenticity narrative, in air quotes if you wonder why I pose, are full of it, and that the minute staying true, the very second that staying true to themselves cuts into their profits, many of them that preach authenticity give up a centimeter, then a meter, then 100 meters, and then a kilometer of their authenticity until perhaps at some point they look back and realize that their entire narrative of being authentic is completely false. So my debates with my marketing advisors were quite ironic because they actually stressed the need for me to retain my authenticity as well to my values. And I responded by saying that the only true way to do this is to take money out of my solution, out of my giving conclusion. So I scolded them for their poor advice, and I told them, hey, if my future customers are like me and their BS meter is strong, then the minute I compromise my mission to maximize profits, they would smell the BS pitch from 1,000 kilometers away. So I told them I'm going to stick to my mission despite the number of customers they thought I would lose by not leading my academy with an easier course that they thought would be a better leading course to convince clients to continue taking further courses for the sake of profits. And I told them that I believe that the type of customers I'm going to attract will completely understand the point of taking one of my most difficult courses first, due to the benefits that course will provide them and enhancing the value of all other courses they take that follow. So I guess we'll have to see who's right. Maybe I'll agree, they have tried to convince me at a very minimum to do a split testing, which means I have two different versions of my website when I launch it, with one leading with the courses I desire and the one leading with the much easier courses that they desire, easier from like an emotional, psychological standpoint. And even, if I agree to do that and I find they're right, that more people will take courses if I lead with easier courses, I'm still going to scrap that split testing model. I mean, they can rub it in my face, but I'm not going to lead with those courses, because as the developer of all 20 courses in my academy, which I spent 20 years of my life, because I spent 10 years in research, 10 years in development, I have far more insight than my marketing advisors as to the order of the courses that will be most beneficial to people that take my courses, not them. And finally, as this is I want to make one other point that just came up regarding martial arts. Sometimes I told you a lot of what I have applied as far as my life philosophy has been drawn from the immense struggles I underwent as a martial artist. And one of my teachers, my very first teacher, who I trained with the most as far as the longest period of time, sometimes he because we knew when brand new students were coming in to like audit the class, right? They weren't sure if they wanted to join, pay the fees to join, but they would come down and sit on the side of the dojo. And sometimes my teacher would have a very difficult session, some session in which people were getting bruised up and hurt, and difficult like knife fighting techniques, which we call the tanto. We use like a wooden knife in practice, and people would never come back. And I would say like, Sensei, why did you give such a technical class today that would be difficult for newbies to grasp? And he said, hey, if they're going to give up because they don't want to put in the work to get to where you guys are, then I don't want these students, because they are just going to quit when times get hard. So that is the kind of mentality I am assuming with SK Wealth Academy as well. So I've gone through training in which I've had to maintain horse stances, which all martial artists will know what that is, for 20 minutes straight. As various students, sometimes ones that were 20 kilograms heavier than myself, would climb on my back for a few minutes at a time and then get off with only a 30-second rest period in between, whereas another student would then climb on your back and you were never allowed to get out of horse stance. And you do this over and over and over for 20 minutes straight. Your legs are going to become rubber at about minute 10. And at that point, for the last 10 minutes, it became a mind over matter battle. If you don't want that to be torture, you had to learn to take your mind to a different place where you can no longer feel that pain. And I actually learned how to do that under the tutelage of my teacher. So as such, I end podcast number 89. This is, again, remember, this is podcast 88B. So podcast 89 is the one that will follow this one. I end that podcast with a quote from Bruce Lee, for all Bruce Lee fans out there, in which he professes that there's only one pathway to freedom in life. So stay tuned. And I have no questions to ask as I end this podcast, as it's just a prelude to podcast 89. So I will end this podcast by saying, please subscribe, please like, please comment below. And as always, remain intensely curious. Until podcast 89, so long and bless up.